Good afternoon. I am Dr. Benjamin Franklin, and I asked you to gather here today because I wish to speak to you about a subject which I think is of interest to all: smallpox, one of the most terrifying curses that has beset our modern age. Now, I have, how shall I say, I am aware that I am a good deal older than any of you that are here now listening to me. I was born in the year 1706 in the colony of Massachusetts Bay in the city of Boston, in a very crowded little house on Milk Street, hard by the place where the Old South Meeting House stands. And even from a very young age, I was conversant with the sort of general calamity that may befall mankind when we live together in cities. When I was 5 years of age, there was a great fire in Boston. It destroyed a large portion of the city. Hundreds of houses were burnt, and though few lives were lost, many homes and businesses were destroyed. Houses scarce a stone's throw distant from our own, where I and my family lived, were burnt. And I can scarce think of that without thoughts of terror. For a child of 5 to be cowering, as it were, in his mother's arms, whilst the roar of the flames in the distance, and the tumult in the street, and the sparks raining down, and us fearful that at any moment our own house could be set alight. And indeed, had the wind shifted just a bit, had the weather been less dry, rather drier that October, it could very easily have happened just that way, and we could have lost everything. In the years that followed, I thought often upon that fire, and I could not help reflect that it spared no one. It seemed to make little difference whether one was rich or poor, pious or impious, virtuous or wicked. All went before it. And I suppose it commenced my skepticism, of which I was very much full in those days, of the workings of divine providence. There seemed very little of providence in that fire. 2 years later, when I was 7, the town was beset by another calamity, measles. Now, none of my immediate acquaintance died at that time, but many did. The city suffered dreadfully, and the lives of many children were lost. And when I was 9, then there was a good deal of talk about smallpox. For I was told it was due. What was meant by that? Oh, I was told the smallpox comes back to Boston about every 12 years. It was last year in 1703, 3 years before you were born. You don't remember it, obviously, but it did great havoc. It killed more than the measles did, and did more than kill. What was meant by that? And let's say one, oh, you know Mr. So-and-so. You mean the blind man I see being led about by his servant? Yes, yes. The smallpox took his eyes. In fact, nearly all the blind people you see in the city lost their sight through the smallpox. Or Mrs. So-and-so. Of course, when Mrs. So-and-so was mentioned, I made a wry face, as a boy of 9 or 10 will. Oh, said I, that ugly old crone, Mrs. So-and-so? Well, I was told, before the smallpox pitted and scarred her face, she was quite pretty. And a better-natured person, I'm afraid, Not only did the pox rob her of her beauty, but it also spoiled her disposition, put it mildly. Well, then I pray the smallpox may be a long while in returning, said I. I said, well, I was told that is a blessing and a curse both. For you see, those that have had the smallpox, they never seem to have it again. And so the one blessing that emerges out of such a visitation is that those that are left are nearly all without fear of it thereafter. But the more years pass between visitations, the more children are born, the larger the number of people who are without defense grows, and the number of people who are immune to that distemper lessens. So the longer the space between visitations by the smallpox, the greater the havoc it wreaks. Why, you know, there's a place in the northern part of the Atlantic called Iceland. Iceland had not had smallpox in a couple of generations. And when it came to that island in 1707, it killed a quarter of the people on it. Indeed, perhaps killed more than it needed to, because in many households there were not any left well enough to tend for the other sick. And some perished merely from neglect. So it is a terrible thing if it is too long delayed, just as it is a terrible thing when it comes. Well, that was too much for a boy of 10 or 12 to make out, and I don't know that I entirely understood all that I was being told. And the years went by, and we saw no sign of it, and I grew thoughtless of it and gave little consideration to smallpox. There were other things to think about. When I was 13 and 14, it was pirates. Now, some of you may know of Blackbeard, you know, that dreadful fellow, Edward Teach. Well, he was not the only pirate about in the days after Queen Anne's War. There were a great many of them. They were a plague to the nation. And they were a hazard even to the shipping going in and out of Boston. And so in 1720, a warship, the HMS Seahorse, under Captain Thomas Durrell, arrived in Boston to be our guardian. Captain Durrell was a hard officer, but he was determined to destroy pirates. He cared nothing for Boston, mind you, but he had high ambitions to win glory for himself. He was only 3 months on post when he took his ship on a cruise down to Barbados. I remember that very well. I remember his departure, in fact, very well, because I had met a couple of the boys on his crew. Boys who were the same age as me. I was at the time apprenticed to my elder brother, James, to learn the printer's trade, and I was not entirely happy in my situation. A part of me still dreamt, as I had when I was younger, of going to sea, and so I was rather jealous of those that sailed on the Seahorse that January. More the fool me. The Seahorse was delayed in returning. It did not come back into Boston Harbor until April 22nd of 1721. And it brought with it the smallpox. Captain Durrell had exchanged some of his crew in Barbados for new, and he had brought some onto a ship that, unbeknownst to him, were ill with that distemper. It grew worse upon his voyage northwards. He was compelled to bury those that died at sea. He arrived in Boston Harbor with several of his crew sick, and rather than interfere with his purpose, that is, rather than doing what a merchant ship would be required to do, which is anchor at Spectacle Island in Boston Harbor, where where Pest House was kept, to await, to stand quarantine until the ship was free of disease. He, bold as brass, sailed right up to Long Wharf and docked. He sent some of his crew ashore to recreate themselves. And those that were ill, he put ashore secretly, so none would know, and if his ship were inspected, it would not be found in a diseased condition. And so, Captain Durrell, who was sent to protect us from the pirates, in the end was the instrument to destroy more than any Blackbeard ever would have done. Now, at the first, it was, oh, a case here or case there. Oh, a couple of sailors in the lodging house. We shall have to quarantine that lodging house. And so a man was put out front with a red flag to warn off anyone from going in or coming out. It was thought that perhaps the pox could be contained in 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 houses and not spread generally to the town. Well, that failed. And by the end of May, it was clear that infections were spreading throughout the town, and people were beginning to succumb to it. The well-to-do began to pack up their belongings and flee the city, going out to the country to escape the contagion. Of course, they weren't welcome in the country towns, and they often took the pox with them out there, and so spread it out beyond the confines of just Boston. The others had to make do as best they could. Now, there's one man in Boston who conceived that he had a notion of what to do about it. A man that, to be perfectly candid, I was not fond of. What boy of 15 is fond of preachers who preach nothing but sin and damnation? But this is the Reverend Mr. Cotton Mather. Now, Mr. Mather was a fellow of the Royal Society, a man of some considerable learning, and however much I may deprecate some of his theological opinions, he was in many respects a man of true knowledge and science. Now, he had read an account a couple of years earlier written by a Dr. Emanuel Timoney, who had observed amongst the Turks at Constantinople a curious practice whereby they would gather together in a house, and a physician, a surgeon, would bring some of the pus, the virus that was taken from a smallpox sufferer. And each of the guests in the house, they would have a small slit made in his arm or her arm, and some of that pus or smallpox matter placed into the cut and closed. All then, of course, became infected and developed smallpox. But here's the remarkable thing about it. None of them had a serious case. None of them was scarred or disfigured. None of them was blinded. None of them died. They spent some days in a fever or uncomfortable, but in the end they all recovered. And, more to the point, they were all thereafter immune. Now, the reason this particularly astonished or interested Mr. Mather is that he had in his household an African slave named Onesimus. And Onesimus had told him the same tale. He had said that in the part of Africa that he had been brought from, this was the practice, that he had been so engrafted or inoculated when he was young, and so he had no fear of smallpox, as the white men did. Well, Mr. Mather was astonished. Is this, in fact, a way in which the people could be preserved? He went to all the physicians in the city. There were a half dozen of them, but none would listen to him. They were all of the opinion, well, we shall follow the practice of Mohammedans and Negroes. Nonsense. We will. That is absurd notion to purposely infect people with smallpox. No, we will not do it. And none was more adamant against the practice than Dr. William Douglas. Dr. Douglas lived in the Green Dragon Tavern, a place very near to the house where my family were then living. they having moved from Milk Street over to Hanover Street. Well, that's not here nor there. Dr. Douglas was 30 years of age. He had studied at Paris and Utrecht and Leiden and Edinburgh. He had degrees of medicine, unlike any of the other physicians in town, who had merely apprenticed. And he was particularly incensed at the suggestion. He said that Mr. Mather dabble with his souls, leave their bodies to him. He was the qualified physician. But one did listen, and that was Dr. Boylston, Dr. Zabulon Boylston. Mr. Boylston, he and his wife had lost many of their own relations and close family to the last smallpox visitation, but just as Mr. Mather had, and Mr. Mather had lost several to the measles too. And so they were willing to undertake the experiment. On, when was it, June, it was late in June, the 21st of June, I think it was, in 1721, Mr. Boylston, Dr. Boylston, I should call him, I suppose, inoculated his son, his 6-year-old son, and 2 of his slaves. He cared for them through the pox, and by July, they were fully recovered without harm. And now he was determined that he had the means by which he could help save many lives. For the smallpox was spreading apace. The number of cases were greater each week than the week before. And the number of deaths were starting to increase. And so Mr. Boylston began to offer this service to those of his patients who were willing to undertake it. Well, the physicians were all in a fury about this. They called him a quack. They called him a charlatan. They said that he would only be spreading the infection by this means. He would not be saving lives. He would be destroying them. He ought to be stopped. The city, for a time, forbade him to do this. But he had already been convinced by his many successes that that was foolish. And he carried on secretly. Now, in the midst of this, and in the midst of this dispute, I must bring up my brother, James. James had been struggling to establish his printing business, and he wished to have something in addition. And so what he thought to do is found a newspaper of his own, to compete with those already being published. But this newspaper should have to have something the others didn't have. It should have to be free of the domination of the church or the state or the city. It should be of completely independent sort. He wanted it to be a place of wit and diversion, not merely dry news, a dry news sheet. And of course, nothing was likely to sell newspapers quite so well as a controversy. And the controversy between Dr. Douglas and Mr. Boylston, Dr. Boylston, was perfect fodder for that. Now, my brother never cared for the Reverend Mr. Mather, for various reasons, and so he was only too happy to side with another young man, one who also shared his animosity toward Mr. Mather, and that is Dr. Douglas. And so he began to publish in his new newspaper, the New England Courant, as he called it, all of Dr. Douglas's diatribes, his attacks on Mr. Boylston and upon Cotton Mather. Mr. Mather, he took that as an attack upon the church itself, and was furious with my brother. And so while the controversy raged in the newspaper and in the street, and the disease spread, and as Mr. Boylston, Dr. Boylston, went about quietly doing his inoculations, the number of burials only increased. On the 1st of October, in his paper, my brother printed a a summary of what had occurred thus far, that as of the 1st of October, there had been some 2,500 cases recorded in the city. Now remember, the city had about 10,600 people living in it before this began. And thus far, yes, some 2,500 of them had been sickened. Now, I know not how many had succeeded in leaving the city, so perhaps 2,500 out of 10,000. Of that number, 1,500 had recovered. 1,000 were presently ill, and 200 had died in a town of 10,000. I got the numbers not quite right, isn't it? So it was 2,700 altogether cases, with 200 dead, 1,500 recovered, and 1,000 still ill. October was the worst. Indeed, there were so many dying that the city ordered the cessation of the customary tolling of church bells for deaths, because they should never stop tolling then, and that they thought would be too dismal. 411 people died that October. And it was not the only hardships the city suffered. For by this time, well, think of all those who rely upon the market to buy their fuel, their food, and so on. Do you think any of the farmers were coming in from the outlying towns to deliver food and fuel into the city? Not in the least. And not everyone had their own means to go out of the city and seek out those provisions in the country towns, even if they were allowed in. Sometimes exchanges were made out in the country, whereas payment was left, and then the buyer had to withdraw a certain distance, and the seller would come forward, collect the payment, and leave the goods, and then withdraw, and the buyer could then come and pick them up off the ground. Only thus could transactions be made. Those that were left. Now, of course, some in the town went about their business as usual, because some had survived the 1703 epidemic, and so they could go about their business without fear. But it was a dismal sight, for it seemed like no one who had not been through it before was going to escape it this time. Now, some of us fell ill, and we were ill briefly and suffered no ill consequence, so sometimes that happens in the natural way, even without inoculation. In the end, Dr. Boylston inoculated some 247, and only a couple of them died. And those, considering experience I have had said, it was likely to have been something else amiss with them before they were inoculated. They may even have been infected in the common way, and so it was too late for me to be inoculated. But each time one of Dr. Boylston's patients died, of course, Dr. Douglas was quick to point a finger and say, "You see, the man is committing murder. He ought to be indicted for murder. He is spreading this disease about," etc., etc., etc. In November, Mr. Mather, confronted by a brother on the street, called down the curses of heaven upon him, made quite a scene in the public street with quite a number standing about to hear it. And that night, someone, and we never knew who, threw a bomb into Mr. Mather's house, a sort of grenado made of iron, with a fuse attached to it. He cast it through the upstairs window, and it nearly hit the man sleeping in the bed up there, a relation of Mr. Mather who was staying with him. When it struck the floor, the fuse was knocked loose, and so it was not set off, but it had been filled with gunpowder and turpentine intended to burst and set the house afire and perhaps kill all within. So high were passions raised that such a thing could occur to a man as respected and distinguished as the Reverend Cotton Mather. Of course, I beheld all this in awe and wonder. I was fortunate enough to survive, and indeed none of my immediate family perished. But by the time it was all done, and it wasn't done until the spring, 844 people had died of the smallpox in Boston. That's something on the order of 1 person in 7 of the, no, 1 person in 12 of the entire town. And of those that had not been through the pox at an earlier time, of course, the figure was higher still. It was a dreadful thing. But Mr. Boylston, he wrote up his findings, the results of his experiment, and published them in the end. He was made a member of the Royal Society. He was lauded for his work, not only in carrying out the inoculations so successfully, but in recording in such meticulous detail all that he had done in the process, so that it could be seen very fully and clearly how many lives, most likely, he had saved, and how many persons he had preserved from disfigurement or blindness. Now, while I've been talking, there have been some who have written. Just want to see if there are any questions here that I should be addressing. Well, it is chiefly folks saying hello, telling me that they are here, and I'm pleased to have you all here with me. Now, but let's return to the business then. I said I would speak for half of an hour, and I've nearly used that now altogether. And I've told you the tale that I most wish to tell you, how that I was persuaded in my youth of the great value and efficacy of inoculation against the smallpox. But I shall not cease. I shall go on, and if any of you wish to remain and hear some more, you're welcome to do, because I do have more I wish to tell you. This has all taken more time than I expected. Now, I left Boston a few years after this. In the end, I settled in Philadelphia, where I have kept my home ever since, although I have spent many years abroad as well. And of course, as soon as I could, I established my own printing business and established my own newspaper. And I made it my policy from the beginning that the Pennsylvania Gazette would not be as the New England Courant, but would be an advocate for and encourage the use of inoculation against the smallpox. And I began, whenever I had a report of some successful employment of inoculation, I of course was careful to print it in my newspaper. I even employed verse for that purpose. Some were claiming that that the use of inoculation was contrary to the principles of religion. I wished to refute that. I believe it a blessing from heaven, as it were, that we should have this means to defend ourselves from this dreadful distemper, which I do not believe is sent upon us by divine providence or guided in that respect, but it is like any natural phenomenon, and we are foolish not to protect ourselves from it. To say that we ought not to protect our bodies with inoculation because pestilences are sent by God is to my mind, is about as sensible as saying we ought not to put roofs on our houses because if God sends it to rain, he intends us to be wet. I do not hold to that. Now I must come to a matter that is personally painful to me. I have a question here, and I understand that this inoculation for the smallpox was being tried in Britain at the same time that Dr. Boylston was trying it in Boston. However, the experiment in London was conducted in much smaller numbers and not with nearly the success that Mr. Boylston's was. So I should say that it is rather the success of Dr. Boylston that reached England rather than the success of the English experiments in this regard that reached America. Now, back to the thing. In 1730, I married. I was 24 years of age. My dear wife, Deborah, and I were joined together that year. And in 1732, she gave me a son, Francis Folger Franklin, a most remarkable and delightful child in every respect. I had, even as a very small lad, I saw great genius, natural genius and potential in him, and I had hope for great things. When he was 4, smallpox was on the rise in Philadelphia. It was almost always there, but it was on the rise. And of course, I desired most particularly to have him inoculated. My wife Deborah disagreed. He was the apple of her eye. She said she could not bear the thought that, oh, what if something should happen? What if we should inoculate him and he should be one of the few that perish under it? But what if he should take it by the natural way? Oh, but he's not been well of late, she said. He's had a flux. Perhaps when he is a bit older, when he's a bit stronger, we could do it. And so we agreed to that. And then my dear little Frankie, he took the smallpox in the natural way. And we lost him. And I shall ever bitterly regret that we did not inoculate him in time. Yes, there was danger even in inoculation, yes, certainly, but I would assure any parent that is of two minds about this that the regret is just as great either way. And it is much to be preferred that the safer choice is chosen. I had an opportunity to do a bit more to encourage the use of inoculation when I went to London. In 1757, I was sent to London as an agent for the Pennsylvania Assembly, and there I made the acquaintance of Dr. William Heberden, a distinguished physician of that country, and a proponent of the inoculation. And I said to him, I fear many in America, they do not understand the value of the inoculation, they don't understand the method of it, they cannot perhaps find a physician willing to undertake the practice, the operation, or a physician who knows the means and why it may be carried out. And so we put our heads together and wrote a sort of pamphlet. Dr. Heberden wrote plain instructions for how the inoculation could be carried out, even by one who was not a physician. If only the virus, the smallpox matter, could be collected, perhaps from a sufferer. I wrote a historical account, you might say, of its various successes, and gave some examples of numbers that had been inoculated, the numbers who were preserved, the numbers who died, the numbers in the same place that took it naturally, and how many of them died, and so on. And we produced a pamphlet, a little thing. Here it is. and we paid to have 2,000 copies of this printed. And I sent them to America to be distributed gratis to any who wished them, in the hope that the more commonly this knowledge was known, the more frequently would the practice continue. You know, when I arrived many years later at the Continental Congress, I was told by Mr. John Adams, that, half in jest, that the only reason that he had been chosen to attend the Congress was that he had been inoculated for the smallpox back in 1764. For everyone knew that, well, smallpox might come and go in other places. It seemed always to be lurking about in Philadelphia, being so great and populous a place, much like London. Mr. Jefferson from Virginia, he said he was inoculated in Philadelphia back in '66 when he was a young man. Colonel Washington, who is now, of course, our great commander, he went through the pox naturally in '47 when he was in Barbados, as a matter of fact. But other members of the Congress had not, and several of them, was it John Hancock and I think Josiah Bartlett and so on, a number of them were inoculated in Philadelphia during the Congress, which was a wise precaution to take. Now, I have a couple other questions here. Let me see how I intended them. How did smallpox even start? That's a great question, and I wonder if anyone has the answer to it. It has been a plague to mankind for as long as anyone knows. But where do these things begin? I could not say. A question concerning Dr. Warren's program of inoculation. Well, it was Dr. Warren that inoculated John Adams in Boston, a great leader of that city. As to his program, I know not what was being done. By 1764, I was in England, and it was not what went on in medical circles in Boston is not something I was much attentive to at the time. And as to Lady Montague's credit, well, Lady Montague was one of the first to introduce inoculation or to spread the news of it in England. But Mr. Mather heard of it through Emanuel Timoney and his writings in the Transactions of the Royal Society. So I don't know if he knew anything about Lady Montague, Lady Mary Montague, but she is certainly deserving of some credit to help make inoculation acceptable in England. Now, General Washington, when he took command of our armies, he was particularly concerned to keep smallpox out of the army's camp. But he did not allow inoculation at the first because he knew that his soldiers would be incapacitated by it for some time. He hoped only to, therefore, recruit healthy men. But in the end, he realized that the only thing for it is to make sure that every man in the army is inoculated. And so not only did he see it done in winter quarters, but from then on, no one could join the army unless he had first been inoculated before he ever appeared for duty. And God knows how many more we would have lost in the war had the general not taken that precaution. I think it did us a lot of good. And yet, to this day, there is controversy about the matter. Mr. Jefferson was telling me that the reason he came to Philadelphia to be inoculated is because it had been all but outlawed in Virginia. Well, not yet, but it would be. It would be almost all outlawed in Virginia. There was a fellow named Smith who came to Yorktown in Virginia, and he inoculated several in 1768, or was it 67? Maybe it was 67. I don't remember now. Unfortunately, he did not keep them quarantined. He did not keep them apart long enough to thoroughly recuperate. And so when they left, supposedly now over the pox, they returned to Williamsburg and passed the infection on to several students at the college and others. And only by great vigilance was Williamsburg able to suppress the matter before it got out of hand. When the two physicians, Dr. Archibald Campbell and Mr. Dalgleish, attempted to inoculate folk in Norfolk, it caused riots, and I believe Dr. Campbell's house was burnt by a mob, and laws were made to all but forbid inoculation in Virginia. Now, there is all of these objectors to inoculation, they do have a point. Inoculation is only effectual when applied to persons properly prepared for it. You don't want to give it to someone who's already ill. It's not proper for very small infants or the very weak. And most importantly, those that have acquired smallpox by inoculation may still give it in its worst form to another. If they are allowed to sort of roam freely, they may feel themselves perfectly well, but that does not mean that they are not able to pass the contagion on to others. And so they must be kept properly quarantined until the infection has run its course, they are entirely recovered, and then they may go out abroad. And so when that has not been attended to, inoculation has indeed done what its critics said it might, spread the infection. So it is important that the matter be attended to in the proper way. But think of this, think on this, and this is where I wish to conclude, really. Think of the thousands, the millions who have perished because of this fell disease over the years. We have now within our grasp the means to stop it, to preserve 99 out of 100 instead of 80 or 70 out of 100. And perhaps more as we understand this better. We stand on the threshold of so much new. There's so much been discovered and learned in these last 80 years since I was a boy. And I should not be surprised to see in the ages to come, as man acquires greater mastery over matter, we shall see all diseases conquered, perhaps even old age itself. I think there's no telling to what heights we might obtain. In the physical sciences, we already make great strides. If only we could make as great strides in the moral sciences, that men should cease to be wolves to one another. Well, here I have gone much longer than I originally intended. I pray that this discourse has been either instructive or diverting. For anything said that is not either instructive or diverting is not worth saying, I'm afraid. I hope that I may see you all again. I hope you were pleased you came and attended this little talk of mine. If you have other questions that I have not addressed, please write to me. If you have not done so, I would like you very much to follow my page, for I should be pleased to have your attendance in future. For if I find this has been pleasing, well, I shall do something similar. I have been thinking about perhaps the subject of flight. Have you heard about balloons and men flying through the air? Or perhaps electricity. Perhaps I could show my Leyden jars and tell you something of my first experiments in electricity. But we shall save that for another day. For now, I bid you all a good afternoon, and I thank you all for attending.